policies. There's no question that he has experience as a prime minister, which nobody else has, and that Benny Gantz has no experience. Let me emphasize that. Zero experience in governance. He was the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff, a career army officer. He was a decent chief of staff, no complaints, but he's used to working in a large bureaucracy where basically he gives the orders and everybody jumps, which is the way the military ought to function. Coalition negotiations, compromises with coalition partners on key issues of policy, negotiations with very complicated international relations, trying to balance the relations with Russia and the United States and China and Brazil and India, trying to figure out how to appropriately move the chess pieces to create positive relations with the Gulf states and move ahead with negotiations with the Palestinians when the Palestinians have a leadership that agreed to sit down to negotiations with us. Benny Gantz needs to serve as a finance minister or a foreign minister or the defense minister in a government, serve in our security cabinet, see how governance works, how governing works, and the art of governing, and then potentially be a reasonable prime minister. But that's a simple answer to the question of the differences between the two main parties and their approaches to a potential peace. Differences are very, very little. Very, very little. I'm looking for a woman first, please. Specifically. Yes, thank you. What's your name? Ophir.
I'm from LA, and I know that there's a lot of opinion globally and within Israel and Palestinian circles. Do you think that at the end of the day, that the people talking about a solution, whether it be a two-state solution or whatever it is about the rights of Israelis and Palestinians, should be a global forum, or do you think that it should be the people who live in those territories and that will be dealing with the direct effects of it?
I don't think there's any question that there's a combination. And I think this is something that the Arab leadership, those who self-identify as Palestinians as well, and the Israeli leadership have recognized for years that there needs to be a combination. Because on the one hand, it has to be the people on the ground who are learning to live with each other and finding solutions of how to live in harmony, in coexistence, one with the other. But there has to be both international support, not just financial support, but ideological, conceptual, political support, but also financial support, and there has to be a wider framework. Because what used to be a given 20 years ago, when the Oslo process started in 1993, over 20 years ago, the idea that if Israel and the Palestinians can make peace, then the wider Arab world will come around, has proven to be false. It's in fact the opposite. That if Israel and the Arab world can come together and create some concept of coexistence and harmony, then the Palestinians as a society can recognize that yes, we can live with Israel, and with the support of the wider Arab nation and other Arab countries can actually come to the table and agree to some important elements of how to live in peace and acceptance of Israel's existence. So I believe that fundamentally it has to be the people on the ground, but it has to be supported by an international effort and framework. Yeah.
My name is Amit. I'm from Sunnyvale, California.
Hi.
I was wondering why you came back to America. Why didn't you stay in Israel?
Well, Amit, that's a funny question. I came here to speak to you. I still live in Israel. I come here for 3-4 times a year. I come here on business. I was actually at a conference for renewable energy and impact investment, social capital in San Francisco last week. My parents still live in San Rafael, so I spent a nice Shabbat and weekend with them, with my wife. And then I'm here to speak with you, and I'm giving a talk in Los Angeles tomorrow. I gave a talk in Napa yesterday about Israel's relations with Africa. And I'll be speaking in New York over Shabbat and next week, and in New Jersey. So I come 3-4 times a year on business, and also to engage in this kind of a dialogue. Yes.
I'm Darren from Long Beach, California. What are the major similarities and/or major differences, specifically between gay rights and women's rights in the U.S. and the Middle East? And do you think that there will ever be full equal rights for both of these, despite the deep political division in both the Middle East and the U.S.?
I'm going to make sure I understood your question. You don't want to know what the difference is between gay rights and women's rights. You want to know what the difference is in approaches to gay rights and women's rights in America versus in the Middle East. And do I hope, or do I see any future for the promotion of women's rights and gay rights in the Middle East in particular? So, it's an interesting question. What's your name? Darren, sorry. I won't put you on the spot. I was going to ask you a question, but I'll make a general comment about this. What I've found in discussions in hundreds of college campuses over the last 20 years is a fascinating dichotomy where students will go out and attend a demonstration on behalf of gay rights, for instance, in the morning, and in the afternoon go out in a demonstration on behalf of, in those days, Yasser Arafat and the PLO, or today, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, an anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian demonstration, without recognizing the internal contradiction that exists in promoting a society where gays are incredibly persecuted. When you ask what the differences are, let's back up for a second and recognize there are very few societies in the Middle East, outside of Israel of course, where there is any such concept as gay rights. Women's rights, a little bit more progress. Jordan, Lebanon, Qatar, Morocco, Algeria, certainly some of the Muslim states that are outside of the Middle East, as I mentioned, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and others, have made progress on women's rights issues, whether it's equal pay or whether it's outlawing honor killings, for instance, or as I mentioned, female genital mutilation, etc. On the whole, it pains me to say, and you can look at reports like Freedom House, which lists these issues very explicitly. There are very few societies in the Middle East that respect any concept of gay rights or women's rights. So, on the one hand, you might say it's an easy thing to compare. America, rights for gays, rights for women. Middle East, no rights for gays and no rights for women. But let's just take a minute to go a little bit deeper. Just not coincidentally, but we'll say by happenstance, when I worked with Mr. Sharansky in the Prime Minister's office, and my job was to connect him with real civil society activists, human rights activists in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Syria, and particularly in the Palestinian territories, I was personally involved in the granting of asylum by our Interior Minister to almost a dozen Palestinian gay men from Bethlehem and Ramallah and Jenin and Tulkarm, who were persecuted by their societies and by the authorities, police and others, for being gay, granting them asylum in the democratic Jewish nation-state of Israel in order to help save them from the persecution that they were suffering. So when we talk about a comparison, I actually have been intricately involved in seeing on the ground how little respect there is for gay rights. And let's talk about women's rights for a minute. Honor killings are still a feature of society within Palestinian society, as well as the wider Arab and Muslim world. I'm not here to diss Muslim, Islam as a religion, or Muslim traditions, or Arab traditional society. I use Japan as a terrific example, and Azerbaijan as another one. And the truth is, Morocco is moving in these directions, where a Muslim Islamic society can exist within still the framework of a free society that guarantees these kind of women's rights and what have you. The problem is that we don't demand enough of this. Now, I'm not here to diss not just those in the Middle East, but our former presidents either. But let's take an example. In 2009, hundreds of thousands of Iranians took to the streets in an eruption of protest against their dictatorial, totalitarian, Islamist regime leaders. Note, I use the term Islamist, a political ideology based on Islam, but it's not necessarily the religion of Islam. We recognize that. I insist on that to make sure that nobody can accuse me of being anti-Islam. But the Iranian regime is by definition a despotic, oppressive, totalitarian regime. That having been said, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in what was then called the Green Revolution. Too few Western leaders, including the leader of the United States of America, European leaders as well, stood up and said to Iran, you need to give more freedom to your people. We have a twisted idea in modern society that, well, it's their country, it's their society. We have no right to suggest that they be different. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, one of the foremost dissidents of the former Soviet Union, has often been quoted by Andrei Sakharov, the leader of the human rights movement there, have both been quoted by Mr. Sharansky as talking specifically about this issue. That we in the Western world have a right and a duty, an obligation, as well as an ability to affect the situation of rights in other societies. These are basic human rights. Women's rights, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and freedom of speech. We have a right and a duty and obligation and an ability to affect other societies without attacking them or invading them, without necessarily calling for the regime overthrow, without necessarily calling for a change in the wider society. I return to the example of Japan, I wouldn't say misogynist, but not a traditional society focused on women's rights traditionally, a traditional, and I said hierarchical society, certainly an Eastern culture, who have developed a rigorous democracy with freedom of expression, with democratic voting, with freedom of religion and the like, within the context of an Eastern tradition. In 2009, the Western world was silent. And that was a disaster. And that's something that we should be ashamed of and we should learn from. That when other societies rise up against their dictatorial leaders, we have an obligation to promote those same human rights, fundamental civil liberties that we take for granted as our inalienable rights, as defined in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence as Americans. And that's one of the most important principles, I think, that has to come out of this kind of a discussion, that we understand not only what we should do, but what we can do to promote those kind of rights. Maybe one last question. I don't know, Rachel and others, I'm Rohi, Jake, I'm following your lead of how much time we have and how much time we should continue this conversation. I'll take a few more questions, and then I think we'll close. Ma? What time is it and when should we finish?
9:30.
And what time?
9:34.
Oh, thank you. Okay, terrific. So, one quick question I'll take from this gentleman here. I'll answer it and then we'll close. And I'll have you stay around for a few minutes if you'd like to
Show me the path forward. Mahmoud Abbas has been there. What is it? 14th year of his 4-year term. What has to change? What does it look like that Israel will have a partner to sit down at a peace table and resolve it? What does that path look like?
What's your name?
Gordon Moulton.
Gordon? You're a member of the community here in San Luis Obispo? I would like everybody to know, I've never met this man. I don't know Gordon.
We've exchanged emails.
What? Have we?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got you in the conference room.
What?
I got you on the radio show.
Oh, Gordon, nice to meet you. So I take it back. I have never met this man, but we had some email contact back and forth, and I did a radio interview on Friday about some of these issues in preparation for this talk. Gordon, nice to meet you. But the point I was making is, I did not plant that question, but it's a wonderful way to end this discussion. We talk about rights and freedom and democracy. It leads us definitely to the question that Gordon's asked. What's the future going to hold? I'm happy to share with you my vision of what real peace in the Middle East will be. I'm happy to share with you that I am confident we will have peace in the Middle East between Arabs and Jews, and it will look like this. It will be based on, number one, the fundamental principles we've been discussing here today. These fundamental freedoms and civil liberties that we take for granted, that should be part and parcel of all of the societies there in the Middle East that we share that fertile crescent, the Levant, with. Number two, it will be based on concepts of coexistence and tolerance and acceptance of the other. It will be based on some ideas that actually I address in my book, which has nothing to do with politics and with issues of Arabs and the Arab-Israel conflict, but does focus a lot on forgiveness, on acceptance, on an understanding of having a goal and a purpose in life that goes beyond our own self-interest. And the truth is that real peace will come in our region when the Arab leadership, the wider Muslim world, and those who self-identify as Palestinian accept the idea and the legitimacy, not de facto but de jure, that the Jews as a people have a connection to Judea, that the people of Israel have a connection to the land of Israel, and therefore there was a legitimacy given to the establishment of the nation-state of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, called the modern nation-state of Israel. When that acceptance then leads to real discussions of how we live together in peace, at that point, all of the issues that today are seen as so central to a supposed peace agreement become, if not irrelevant, certainly eminently resolvable. And I can prove this because my friend Muhammad, who I mentioned before, Muhammad Dajjani, the head of the Wasatiyah movement, he and I sat in a room once, about 7 years ago, and I am being 100% honest with you in saying that it took us 45 minutes to resolve all 5 of the issues that international negotiators have always pinpointed as the crucial issues to an Arab-Israel peace agreement. Water, refugees, borders, security, and now I'm forgetting what the 5th one is. It doesn't matter. 45 minutes it took us to resolve these issues. Why? Because at base there was a desire for peace. At base there was an acceptance and a forgiveness of the processes over the last 50, 70, 100 years. And therefore the issues of who's sovereign over what territory became much less important. If an Arab-Israeli citizen of Israel can live in Haifa, or Ramla, or Lod, or Yaffo, can walk the streets of Jerusalem, can both visit and be served and serve in a hospital or the Knesset, and can go to a mall without fear of having his throat slit, if that is possible, then conceptually we can recognize that it's possible that a Jew could live in Hebron, Arab Hebron, could live in Janid or Tulkarm, Kalkilia, Jericho, and live there as a Jew, whether they're a citizen of a new state of Palestine or retain their citizenship in Israel becomes irrelevant. Because with real peace, the borders won't matter. Think for a second, and I'll end with this. Just let's acknowledge together that Germany and France were at war for 800 years. Prior to World War II, if you were ever to suggest to a German or a French person that they would one day join in not only an economic union, but a political union, giving up their sovereignty, creating a joint identity as Europeans, they would have laughed at you. 800 years of warfare between Germany and France was ended because both parties recognized there was a greater good to pursue. Both parties recognized that territorial and national sovereignty was less important than peace between them and providing benefits to their people through economic development and social development. Peace will come between Arabs and Jews, between the Israelis, the Arabs, and Palestinians, when that kind of a concept is the basis for our negotiations and discussions, not the piece of paper that will be in agreement about this or that border, or this or that return of a refugee right, Jews, refugees, or Arab refugees. Now, I can't tell you how soon that will be. I can share with you my optimism because I know Palestinians and Arabs and other Muslims who work for and towards these ideals. I've been privileged to work with these civil society and human rights activists. I know they exist. They're not talked about in the New York Times. They're not given profiles in CNN, but they do exist. And it will happen one day. I don't know whether that will be in 2 years, or 2 decades, or 2 generations. But there's no question, my confidence is based on an inevitability of humanity's desire for the kind of freedoms we've discussed today, which basically are the birthright of every human being, including those who live in the Middle East. Thank you very much for your patience today.
Another round of applause for all your green guys.
4-0.